Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today is our fifth Output-Based Aid webinar series. I will be your moderator today. My name is Yara Salem. I'm a Senior Infrastructure Specialist with the Output-Based Aid program. And I focus actually on solid waste sector. That's why I'm moderating this session today. And I hope that we will start a discussion that will continue even after this webinar today. I will start actually by introducing what this webinar's series are all about before I introduce Marcus and then give you some small idea about our presentation today. So our webinar series started some time ago, and it aims to facilitate the peer-to-peer exchange among the output-based aid experts, partners, stakeholders, clients, etc. And usually these series are done on monthly basis, and they address the various topics that we deal with, such as urban transport, solid waste, public-private partnership, etc. I'm not sure if any of you is new to the output-based aid concept, but if you are, please make sure to check us out at our external website, which is at gpoba.org, or you can check our Spark site, YOBA. And there are lots of resources and e-learning courses, etc. on the topic. I'm glad that we will have Marcus with us today to talk about solid waste management. I'm sure most of you know Marcus. He's very famous around here. So Marcus is an urban economist with the Social, Urban, Rural and Resilience Global Practice of the World Bank. And he's been working currently on solid waste, decentralized governance, municipal finance, and he focuses mainly on East Asia region. And Marcus worked in the urban anchor before working with a bank some time ago, and he focused on urban environment with sustainable cities, solid waste management, etc. And Marcus used to work for the UN Environmental Program in Kenya before joining the bank. So today we're very happy actually that we will be discussing in this webinar, as I mentioned, the solid waste management topic, and Marcus will be discussing the result-based financing mechanisms in the solid waste sector and the role that output-based incentives could play in improving the services and outcomes. And this presentation draws on a recent report we just launched 2-3 weeks ago on results-based financing for municipal solid waste, which where Marcus has led the production and the production of this report. And this report have case studies that cover the unique solid waste sector challenges, and also it provides local and relevant results-based financing project designs. And this report has been sponsored by GPOBA, and it was prepared by Marcus Unit. And we're really excited to have Marcus now, who's gonna build on the finding of this report, and he will be sharing this information with us now. And just before I move to Marcus, I just want to explain a few things about how you can participate while Marcus is presenting. So for your Q&A, you can type your questions during the presentations in the chat box located at the right of your screen. And I hope we will be able to address all your questions during the Q&A period after Marcus finishes his presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will be moving to Marcus. Marcus, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours. Please.
Great. Thanks very much, Yara. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's great to see such a large number of people joining us for this webinar. I'd like to start off by mentioning that this piece of work, or rather all of the work that we pulled into the report, which was launched recently, really drew upon the work of, I would say, several teams over several years. And so on the GPOBA side, I would mention in particular not just Yara, who's been with us, really, important in helping moving this forward, but also Esther Learning, who had really helped us conceptualize some of this from the beginning. And working in the sort of in the core team with me have been Farouk Bana and Renee Ho and Sopa Kaza. And then more broadly, you'll see in some of the case studies that we present, many of these cases involved World Bank teams working on investment projects in specific locations. And for example, also we worked with some external partners, like in Penang, Malaysia. The work there was supported by CCAC, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, with which we collaborated with UNEP IETC. And let me just go to the next slide. So just in terms of the outline for the presentation today, you see the outline there. I'll start with a brief introduction on some of the basic solid waste challenges, and just a quick introduction on some of the concepts of results-based financing, RBF. Then the real meat of the presentation lies in the case studies, and this will be a little bit of a whirlwind global tour, showing you what we've done or what has been done in different countries. And then finally, we'll have a section wrapping up on lessons learned. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this section on solid waste challenges. I'm sure many of us do work in this sector, and but I just wanted to mention a few figures from the water waste report that the World Bank put out a few years ago. Large quantities of solid waste, and as incomes and urban populations grow, we would expect these quantities to continue to increase. Now, in developing countries, the problems are particularly acute, and you'll see there in the the bottom half of the slide, there are health impacts, environmental impacts, and particularly the greenhouse gas emissions, which are a concern in terms of the overall climate change mitigation strategy for the world. In terms of waste generation, I think these pie charts here are no surprise. Waste quantities are generally correlated, obviously, with population numbers and with income levels. And in terms of waste collection, again, I would say it's no surprise that the higher the income level in a country or a city, the better the coverage of the collection system is. This slide then just attempts to summarize some of the challenges that we commonly encounter in different parts of what I call the value chain in municipal solid waste. And this is just sort of a very sort of generic summary of what some of them are. So on the more upstream side of things, it's relatively rare to encounter good programs or initiatives to reduce the quantity of waste generated in the first place. Then after the waste is generated, you need to collect and transport it, and that's when you encounter all sorts of issues with low collection rates, particularly in lower income countries or in poorer areas in a city. Then we don't just want to collect it, but we want to divert as much of it as possible. So recycle, compost, etc. And in many places, this is done, much less than we would like, or it's done in a very informal way, or the informal sector does it, and there's not very much attention paid to issues of informality in the sector. Then on the disposal side, there are issues with making sure that the waste is disposed into sanitary landfills, and also just operating operating the sanitary landfills well, and also closing dump sites and unsanitary disposal. And then there are also, I think, some opportunities for energy recovery, particularly in terms of landfill gas. And then on the some of the other issues when it comes to waste to energy, particularly in developing countries, is the pros and cons for incineration. Now, I tend to also think that one of the biggest fundamental challenges in the solid waste sector is, in fact, financing. And that is to say that when you work with a city or with a city government on improving the sector in their city, some of the initial questions might be about, okay, what technology do we select, or what sort of operations system should we adopt, right? But many of the fundamental, the root challenges are actually financing, and particularly the sustainable financing of operations. The sort of more traditional or conventional World Bank investment project in solid waste would finance or invest in capital investments like a new sanitary landfill. But then very often where I think we don't do as well as we ought to is really helping to ensure the sustainable financing of the whole system for the long term. So you see there a number of facts, or stylized facts, I should say, that solid waste is usually one of the largest budget items on municipal budgets, and yet it's sometimes a lower priority for cities and municipalities. And I think the challenge here with financing particularly is that cost recovery is low because there's low willingness to pay, and operations could be made more efficient. So that was a very, very quick introduction. Let me just move on now to the next section, giving an overview of results-based financing. So you see, sort of very simple definition here on this slide. It's where we make payments, usually from a public source, based on verified results. You set them up front, you predetermine what those targets or results should be up front, and then you pay only once the results are successfully verified. Now, results-based financing is an umbrella term which can include a number of very specific mechanisms. So output-based aid has a specific definition, and so it's a type of RBF. In the solid waste sector, I would say that performance-based contracting has been used in a number of places in different parts of the world. So that, broadly speaking, would be a form of RBF. And then depending on how much you've worked in some other sectors, you might be familiar with some other types of RBF as well. Carbon finance is one of them, where you only get paid if you do actually generate the verified emissions reductions. And conditional cash transfers are another example from the social sectors, like in education and health. I wanted also to show this slide to just summarize the basic conceptual difference between a conventional, traditional input-based approach to doing things, or even to providing donor funds with projects, and what we understand or think of as output or results-based approaches. I won't, read out everything on this slide, except to point out 2 points. I think one phrase we use sometimes here is the theory of change, and that's basically to say, well, what is our logic or the storyline for how cause and effect are supposed to be related to each other in this project that we're designing. And secondly, the second point I would emphasize is where the risk ends up sitting. So with an input-based approach, if I'm financing inputs, I'm going to, spend money on procuring, these waste trucks, or I'm going to build this landfill. I'm, providing inputs, and the risk is actually on me as the provider of the inputs, because there are many things which I might not be able to control in terms of the actual outcomes which are achieved after the inputs are made. On the other hand, with output-based approaches, the performance risk is in fact shifted to the, in this case, what we're calling the service provider on this slide. But basically, you're placing the performance risk on whoever it is supposed to deliver the results, because if they don't deliver the results, then they don't get paid. I just wanted to show you also on this slide where some of the case study locations have been, and it gives you again a flavor of the global tour that we're going to take you on right after this. So this brings us to the next section, and which will be the bulk of this presentation on the case studies. I realize that time is short, so I'm going to try and go quickly. Now, for each location, we've summarized basically the story for that location into 3 slides. The first slide gives you a bit of background on the situation in that location. Then the second slide is on the design solution that we came up with applying RBF principles. And the third slide, which I think many people are often very interested in, is on the specific way in which results were verified, because that really is the core of operating an RBF scheme. So in Nepal, I would say that Nepal is actually very typical of a lower income country in terms of the municipal solid waste challenges that they face. And so the design solution in Nepal, let me try and explain it. So, and I'm going to use the pointer here and illustrate it with the slide. So this is sort of like the baseline situation in the 5 Nepalese municipalities that the project is working in, where you know, they have these costs here below the line, you know, in terms of operations and maintenance and capital costs and so forth. This is what the government currently provides in black. And so then the funding gap was this gray area here. And so basically, it was a very it was a typical situation where you know, there was this funding gap, and so they weren't able to provide a good level of solid waste services, including collection, and they weren't actually collecting very much fees at all. Now, the basic idea then is that the output-based subsidy, as you see here in the light gray, would help to cover the funding gap, but then the subsidy would decline or decrease over time as what you see here in green, what we're calling the verified beneficiary revenue, or basically the solid waste fee collection, increases. There was also some expectation that the government would increase modestly what they were putting in to fund the system as well. Now, one of the key results which we were looking for in the Nepal design was, in fact, to verify that the fees were being collected, and not only that, that the fees were increasing over time. And then the OBA subsidy, the payment of the output-based subsidy, was contingent on the amount of fees collected. Now, a very important point on this slide I would mention is that what is implicit in this design is the assumption that people would actually be willing to pay, or their willingness to pay would increase, you know, to pay the solid waste fee, as they saw visible improvements in service coverage and delivery. The verification system in Nepal consists of 2 parts. So the first was in terms of what we called service provision indicators. So it was more of a technical verification with technical scorecards, you know, site verification that you know, the waste was being collected, you know, according to the indicators specified. And it was only after you have a successful verification of sort of this part 1 service provision indicators that you then move on to verification of part 2, which is the financial performance indicators, in terms of you know, confirming that they were actually collecting solid waste fees. And this was verified based on what was actually deposited into the municipality's account for solid waste services. And the successful verification of part 2 then triggers the payment of the OBA subsidy. Now, I would also add that the way the OBA project in Nepal was designed, you know, it did adopt a comprehensive approach where an important part prior to even trying to do verification was ensuring that the municipalities, you know, have a solid waste strategy and action plan, and that there's a system in place to monitor performance. The West Bank is also a place where, you know, you have not uncommon solid waste challenges. And I would point out here that although the collection rates are high as 98%, they had the challenge with disposing into unsanitary dump sites. And even after a sanitary landfill was constructed, and which has recently begun operation in the West Bank, there was a challenge of longer-term operations and maintenance as well. And also, the other thing, which is, I guess, a little bit unique about the West Bank, is the political situation, which causes some private and international investors to view the context as being risky compared to other places. So similar to Nepal, the design solution in the West Bank was to provide an OBA subsidy And this was to offset the increased costs associated with disposing into the new sanitary landfill. And again, similar to Nepal, the subsidy is designed to decrease over time as the fee collection increases. Now, because this project was funded through the IFC, it was a condition that the funds had to flow to the private sector. And so the way the financial arrangements were structured for this project were that the grant funds would be paid to the landfill operator on behalf of the municipal councils in the West Bank. And in effect, this represents a payment guarantee to the private operator. So what were the results to be verified? You'll see they're summarized there in the table, and similar to Nepal again, there are two parts to it, or two categories. One is the actual improvement in the solid waste service delivery, and you'll see there this included a cleanliness index based on visual inspections of how clean the streets are. And then the other part was on the fee collection and also a metric of cost recovery. So it does take into account the total operating costs, and indirectly, therefore, provides an incentive for the overall operating costs to be kept as low as possible. I'll move on now to a separate set of case studies on source separation and recycling in 3 countries. These are mostly in Asia. Now, in China, in the city of Ningbo, which is not far from Shanghai on the coast, Ningbo is a large port, an industrial city, and the World Bank there has been supporting a large investment project to basically transform the solid waste sector of the city to get people to start separating their waste at source. And you'll see there that one of the challenges was that the project was going to put in all of these financial investments into overhauling the solid waste system, to start managing the waste according to 4 streams of separated waste. However, if people didn't change their behavior to start separating waste at source, then the whole system wouldn't work, and basically all the money spent on investments would have gone to waste. So the design solution in Ningbo was to provide what we're calling incentive payments to neighborhood residence committees. So these were sort of the lowest level of administration, or at the neighborhood level in the city, and we defined the outputs as the separated waste, both in terms of the quality and the quantity of the waste. So the quantity of the separated waste, but also the quality, meaning the purity of the separated waste. And depending on how well each neighborhood performed, they would then get the incentive payment. Now, one important point to note is that in order to ensure the long-term sustainability of these incentive payments, if the city wanted to be giving these incentive payments indefinitely, we tied the incentive payment amounts to the cost savings that the municipality would enjoy if people successfully separated their waste. The way the results were verified, I've already mentioned that we had quantity measures and quality measures, and these quality measures have been structured to be random visual inspections. And there was a composite score, which we call the neighborhood overall score, which is basically these quantity and quality measures put together. Now, each neighborhood was required to achieve a certain minimum score in order to be eligible for an incentive payment. And then depending, once they achieved that minimum score, depending on how well they scored above that up to a certain maximum, then the incentive payment was scaled accordingly. With UNEP, IETC, and with the support of CCAC, we also worked in Penang, Malaysia, where the World Bank does not actually have a lending program. So this was basically technical assistance to the state government of Penang, where the priority that the state has for solid waste includes encouraging source separation of organic waste, because as you'll see there on the slide, approximately half of their waste stream is so organic or putrescibles. Penang is also very densely populated, so a significant quantity of their waste originates from high-rise residential buildings, and so this was the area in which we focused on. The design solution here was similar or akin to NINGBO, in the sense that we designed it to provide incentive payments to high-rise buildings if residents would start separating their organic waste. Now, this also was tied to the amount that the municipality would save from not having to collect, transport, and dispose the mixed waste. Meaning to say that if the organic waste was successfully separated, the residual or mixed waste stream would be reduced, and so the municipality would achieve cost savings there. Now, in Penang, one thing which was unique was that in different parts of the state, they had already chosen different technologies for how they were going to process the separated organic waste. And so on Penang Island, it was an on-site waste processing machine, if you call it. There was a specific technology they're using to transform the organic waste into liquid fertilizer. And on the mainland, called Seberang Perai, a private composting company was interested in collecting the waste and producing compost, which they would then sell. So depending on the technology that they used, the verification system sort of varied. So in Penang, because the machine would only accept pure organic waste, we only needed a quantity measure. And in Seberang Perai, there was also a quality score, based on the purity of the waste done by visual inspection. But ultimately, each high-rise building would receive a collective building score. And then again, they had to have a minimum score, and there was a maximum possible payment, which was also specified, tied to how much the municipality would be saving. And again, because this wasn't a World Bank investment project, the state government of Penang intends for in next calendar year to be making the budget allocations to fund these incentive payments. Indonesia, we worked to do these designs in 3 cities, Tangerang, Balikpapan, and Manado, in different parts of the country. And here it was quite different from China and Malaysia. In Indonesia, the design focused on what we call waste banks. In Bahasa, they're called bank sampah, which are basically small community-based operations that perform basically an aggregation function. So you'll see some photos of waste banks here on the slide, where people would bring their recyclables to the waste bank, and the waste bank would aggregate all of it so that basically a middleman would come and basically come and purchase the larger quantities of waste, of recyclables. Now this works well in lower income communities, and what the individual depositor, the individual person who comes to deposit waste into the waste bank, what they get is kind of like a bank account book, a savings account book, where every time they bring like a kilo of plastics or paper, that's annotated in the book, and it sort of forms a kind of a way of savings for them, because maybe about once a year, that's when they go to the waste bank and they withdraw their savings as cash. And so that's how the waste bank, which is usually community operated by women in cities in Indonesia, performs that aggregation function. Now, the objective in Indonesia was how we could support the scaling up and replication of waste banks. The waste bank model already operates in a number of communities in different cities in Indonesia quite successfully. So the idea was how to promote this more, and so that we would achieve more waste diversion and recycling, particularly in lower income areas of Indonesian cities. So the incentive payments in this case were to be given to the city governments if they could motivate a minimum percentage of household participation in waste banks. This also was the reasoning for this was so that because we felt that it was important for the city governments to have a strong level of ownership over the waste banks and the whole system of waste banks in their city, and to get the city governments to be working closely with the community organizations on the waste banks. Now, the incentive payments were again tied to the cost savings that the municipality would be able to achieve from having to manage less waste in their collection and transport systems. And the incentive payments were structured to be phased over time. Now, you'll see the phasing there and some of the results that we were looking for verification. So at stage 1, it was the participation rate, basically how many households were registered at the waste banks, and that the waste banks were set up and had some basic operational mechanisms in place. The subsequent stages were to get the participation rate to increase, and then to encourage individual account holders at each waste bank to be actively depositing quantities of recyclables with the waste bank. I realize that I'm running over time now, so I'm going to move quickly to the last category on Tanzania and Jamaica. In Dar es Salaam, the situation was different from some of the other case studies that we've talked about. Here, primary collection in the informal settlements in Dar es Salaam, in many places, it actually exists because communities self-organize. The challenge was more with the secondary collection, and from neighborhood collection points to the city's dump site. Basically, the city government was not effectively collecting and transporting the waste, which was collected through the primary collection in the first place. And so one of the key consequences of that was that because the primary collectors had nowhere to put the waste, or because the waste wasn't being collected by the city, they ended up dumping their waste in waterways, which contributed to flooding problems in the city. So the design solution in Dar es Salaam was twofold. One was to, in places where primary collection wasn't already organized, it was to support primary collection in some of these underserved communities. But the second part of the design solution was to incentivize the municipality to improve their performance with the secondary collection. So similar to what was designed for Nepal and the West Bank, what you'll see there was for both parts of the scheme, the intention was to provide an interim subsidy, which was relatively large to begin with, and to phase the subsidies out over time as the amount of fee collection increased. So the assumption here again, which was implicit in the design, well, we tried to make it explicit in our design documents, was that people would be more willing to pay as they experienced better or improvements in the solid waste service that they were receiving. The results which were verified, again, this was inspired by Nepal and the West Bank. So you'll see there, there was, neighborhood cleanliness index, how well or effectively the primary collection was being undertaken to the neighborhood collection points. And then for the secondary collection, it was how much waste was actually being taken each day from the collection point to the disposal site, and also how much was diverted for recycling or composting. Jamaica was also a World Bank investment project, and here the situation, I guess, was akin to Dar es Salaam in a sense that you had these underserved communities, low-income communities, where the waste was not being collected effectively, and in this case, the National Solid Waste Management Authority was facing challenges in terms of collecting the waste from these communities and disposing of them. I would add that the other thing in Jamaica that we encountered was that because waste wasn't being collected and the environment was basically becoming less clean, this sort of, I guess, contributed to sort of like a vicious cycle of sort of insecurity and crime and sort of community breakdown in these locations. So the idea was, if we can also improve the solid waste situation, that would, improve the overall living environment and quality of life for communities in these places. So as part of the Inner City Basic Services project, there were incentives provided in kind to the Solid Waste Management Authority that if they were able to improve the waste collection services, they would actually get a truck of a certain equivalent value that you see there. But then within each community as well, financial incentives are being offered to environmental wardens, these are individuals, and also community-based organizations, the CBOs, based on the targets, which you see there, that the environment was clean and that that there was certain target on recyclables and organics, which was being met. And these are and the environmental wardens basically get paid a stipend or a salary, and then the CBOs would get basically a grant which they could use for for something for a purpose in their community. Now you'll see there the results summarized on this slide, or how that they would be measured. One, for the Solid Waste Management Authority, it was in terms of the absence of waste, meaning to say that the waste had been collected and how regularly it had been collected. And then for the environmental wardens and the CBOs, it was in terms of how clean the waste skips are and how clean the overall community is, and also the percentages of recyclables and organics which were diverted. And again, there was a minimum score and a potential maximum score. So let me wrap up now by just summarizing some key lessons learned. I think there were some very general lessons that we drew, which we felt were relevant for solid waste projects in general, not just RBF. And you'll see them there. You know, it's important to have good baseline information, to get all stakeholders involved, and to really step back a little bit and not always assume that we just need more inputs, you know, more staff or more vehicles or a bigger landfill. That some of the solutions could actually lie in changing behaviors and changing the way that the different stakeholders perform their roles. Lessons on RBF projects for solid waste. I think there are a number of them that we would like to emphasize. One is that we found that in some cases, the payments could be targeted at the municipalities rather than the individual households, or in the cases of China and Malaysia, targeted at a sort of a neighborhood committee again rather than individuals. Obviously, the incentives should be carefully aligned towards what would incentivize individual behavior or changes in behavior. And we did struggle actually with the challenge of, on the one hand, setting the incentives so that they would be financially sustainable for the long term if the government intended to keep the incentives indefinitely. On the other hand, they had to be of an amount which was, sizable or meaningful enough to actually incentivize behavior change. And again, one way in which we achieved that was to say that rather than giving small individual payments to individuals, we would aggregate and provide the incentive payments at the neighborhood level. You'll see, or you would have seen from a number of the case studies, that upfront financial assistance, basically to plug the funding gap in operations, would be an important part of the solution so that the service levels can be improved very quickly at the beginning. And I think with any sort of RBF approach, I think it's important not to micromanage, meaning to say that you need to allow the service providers to some flexibility to decide how exactly they're going to mobilize themselves and operate to achieve the results that were agreed upon at the outset. So verification is very important, a part of the implementation of an RBF schemes. So a number of lessons we drew from there. One was that outreach and technical assistance are very important, particularly in areas where there's not very much capacity to start with. By linking with larger World Bank investment projects, we felt that that provided us more leverage for actually designing and building an RBF scheme. In some places, we found that the proposed institutional arrangements for the flow of funds and for the verification were very complex, and we're still struggling with some of that, for example, in Nepal. And so a challenge for us we see is to always try and keep things as simple as is practicable. And then that also applies to the verification, because if your verification or your indicators are too simple, then that doesn't become very meaningful. On the other hand, if you try and make them more comprehensive or sophisticated, it might become too complex or complicated for people to understand, and then for verification. Lastly, third-party verification is, I would say, like the gold standard in RBF, but this can be costly. So it would be good sometimes to consider whether there could be alternative ways of verifying, so that you don't have to pay someone necessarily to come and do an independent verification. And lastly, and let me wrap up here, I think it's just important to keep the broader solid waste context in mind, just to make sure that whatever RBF design that you do come up with doesn't actually have these unintended consequences or side effects on other parts of the sector or outside of the sector. And also that I think one of the biggest challenges in solid waste is to motivate changes in behavior, and that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and so one must be realistic in terms of expectations of what can be achieved. So that brings me to the end of the slides I had, and I see now that there are a number of questions. So let me stop here and I guess hand back to you, Yara.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for this articulate presentation. As usual, you're fascinating. And thank you so much for taking us on this RBF global tour. I hope our participants had enjoyed the presentation as I did, and I'm really appreciative for our participants who sent us lots of questions. I'll try to kind of combine questions into few so we can answer them in the time that remained. We received the questions from Joseph, Jessica, Inga, Harris, etc. So and most of the questions actually are on West Bank project. And but also, they might be applicable, we can address them for West Bank, but also they might be applicable to other projects in other country context. So we have first questions on if the project in West Bank has involved providing any capacity building support to assist the municipalities in the fee collection effort. And Marcus, just to note that if you need me to chip in at any point for the West Bank project, I'm available as well.
Yes, I was actually going to turn it back to you, Yara, because I think you know the details of the GPOBA projects in West Bank and Nepal actually better than me.
But I mean, we're all a team here. So, but I'd like actually, because I'm just working, Joseph, who asked this question, just because I'm currently working specifically on this issue, I would like to address your question.
Yeah.
So in terms of the capacity, thank you, Marcus, really. In terms of the capacity building support, actually there has been a component of capacity building. However, it wasn't big enough, I think. And that's why we're thinking now of doing some very minor restructuring and to increase the capacity building needed at the municipality level. However, this capacity building we've been doing has been combined with a community awareness campaign, because we wanted to build the capacity of the municipalities, but also raise the awareness of public about what the new roles of the municipalities are. So this effort has been extremely successful, and we're monitoring how the public are responding into this fee collection issue. But meanwhile, we're building the capacity of the municipalities to be able to cope with the new pressure to collect fees. However, if you need more details on what's happening with the current capacity building restructuring, we would be very happy to provide you with updated information, because we're going through this process now. Let me now move to the second question, Marcus, but also it's on West Bank. So if you like to say something, please do, and if then I can add something. So it's a question about how does the amount of output-based aid subsidy provided vary depending on how the service providers perform according to technical scorecards, or it was 100% compliance or 100% compliance was required for the subsidy? Would you like me to take that one too?
Yes, Yara, if you could take that one, and then I'll make a general comment on this point.
Okay. So actually, in terms of the amount of subsidy, it was actually provided based on the scorecard. But and we had like 57 municipality and village councils involved in this project. So we couldn't just ask them to be 100% compliant for them to receive any of the subsidies. There was a rate. And according to the technical scorecards, we provided this rate. There was a higher rate and a lower rate. So and we would pay them according to how they perform in the rate of this scorecard. But also if they reach like the highest rate, which like let's say threshold, if they exceeded that, we're not going to pay them more subsidy. So they have, so I mean, some municipalities actually did outperform, but we have this kind of threshold, lower one and higher one, and we don't exceed or reduce the subsidy. We pay you if you are performing within this rate. And that has been the design. But also, I wanted to mention very important aspect here is that even if you don't perform according to the technical scorecards for some reasons, and in most cases it's political, that you're unable to fulfill your duties basically towards the technical scorecards, we will give municipalities or village councils a grace period. So they will have two periods basically to come back and try to comply with the requirements of the scorecards. So that there is a flexibility element exists in the payment of the subsidy and we aligned it with the country context, especially the political context. Please, Marcus, back to you.
Yeah, so a general comment or response on this question as well, which is to say that I think in a number of these schemes, and I think you'll see there, I kind of almost like implicit in some of the slides, there were certain minimum conditions or like preconditions, if you will. So, for example, in Nepal, it was to say that, okay, for any municipality to embark on this scheme and to be eligible for the OBA subsidies, they had to have their solid waste management strategy and plan in place, and they had to have this monitoring system in place already. So that was the precondition in order to get started or to be eligible to for the scheme. Then another design feature that that was quite common, particularly in China, Malaysia, and even Indonesia, and also what we designed for Dar es Salaam, was to say that there's a certain minimum score. So with waste separation, we said, you have to achieve a 50% score, and that's a composite of, the quantities and the purity score, the quality score, which is based on the purity of the separated waste. But you have to achieve 50%. And if you don't achieve at least 50%, then you don't get the incentive payment. But then between 50% and the 100% score, it was basically scaled. So if you achieved 75%, you would receive 75% of the maximum potential payment, and the maximum potential, or the maximum possible payment, was specified up front. And as I'd mentioned, the way we designed this was to say that let's set the maximum payment at, let's cap it at the amount that the municipality would be saving if this whole scheme was successful. And so that amount is basically set up front and announced or made publicly known, so that all of the participants, know in advance what the maximum possible payment would be. And then depending on their score, if it's 50, 70, 80%, they would then know how much they would be getting. And so in Penang and also in Ningbo, the city government announces in advance of each verification cycle what the maximum payment would be for that verification cycle. Back to you,
Okay.
Yara.
Great. And we have a related question actually on how difficult it was to convince people of the benefit of paying for solid waste management services. And how did we address in our projects the issues on related to change in behavior? And what was the uptake of the services in our projects? And was there a particular approach that we found to be the most convincing with our beneficiaries? I mean, this project, the question was related to West Bank, but I mentioned it in a way the issue with the campaign of promoting awareness, community awareness. But please, Marcus, if you would like to address this question in other country context and in other projects.
Yeah, so maybe again, I'll speak to it generally and give some other examples, and then maybe Yara, you might want to speak again to the specific responses on this question in the West Bank. I think generally it's, well, obviously very difficult to convince people that they should pay for solid waste services or that there are benefits. Having said that, I think particularly in lower income communities, like in informal settlements in places like Dar es Salaam, for example, people already do pay for the very basic sort of hand cart primary collection. So I think at some level, people are willing to pay. And then you have this chicken and egg situation where if you ask them, can you pay more or would you pay more if the municipality came to collect this fee from you in Dar es Salaam or in Nepal or wherever, then they would say, well, why should I? Because I don't see that that my money would actually be effectively used to improve the service. So you have this chicken and egg situation. Now, I would also say that on a particular approach to be most convincing to beneficiaries, I think the outreach and the engagement to I would say not just leaders, but key individuals in the community who can be very influential. So they might not be in a formal leadership position, but they are like influencers in the community. In my experience, that has been very important and very useful, where if you could reach these people and sort of convince them of how valuable and important the change would be, they're then able to influence other people in the community and really mobilize the change in behavior. Now, the other general point I would make on this is that these designs or these case studies that we presented today, many of them are either just about to start implementation or have been in implementation maybe for a year and a half. So I think obviously including through a possible second phase of TA funding from GPOBA, we would be wanting to not just work in some new places, to come up with some new designs on RBF and solid waste, but also to continue to follow and evaluate and synthesize the lessons we're learning from the implementation of these existing schemes. Back to you, Yara.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Marcus. But I just wanted to add one thing actually relevant to the West Bank project, and actually somehow related to Nepal project. In terms of changing people attitude, etc., and the behavioral change, in both countries, actually, there have been community campaigns with the students in schools to convince them of the benefits of such change, and so to play on the fact that the kids will go home and will influence their parents. And there has been lots of art campaigns, etc., on solid waste in schools, etc., to encourage kids to believe in the concept and to play a role in this. And actually, in Nepal, it was quite impressive walking in streets. At some point, I was in Nepal, in Kathmandu, and I saw all these art posters in the street and to emphasize the importance of people's behavior in cleaning the country. So that's one thing that could be done at the community level also to improve how to improve and change behavior. Now I will go to another question, actually, Marcus, related to issues related to the different financial tools that could be used in combination with output-based aid to achieve results. So I have a question from Harris that says both carbon finance and output-based aid are results-based approaches. And at the same time, solid waste management projects, of course, has an effect on climate mitigation and the reduction of GHG. So based on the case studies we've been reviewing and your experience in the sector, could you consider a financing scheme that blends the certified emission reductions with OBA subsidies? Or this is a little bit of the focus of this report, or if you think that that's something you could address, please.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure if I have
I
the
thought so.
answer. I think
Yeah, it's a little bit technical. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Please go ahead.
if the carbon markets and the post Kyoto Protocol world were more active and we had a higher carbon price and so forth, or I should put another way and be more forward looking, if we were able to successfully construct a a global carbon market with carbon prices and so on and so forth, I think there would be many opportunities for landfill gas projects and so on and so forth to be more financially viable and to be paid for the emissions reductions that they do generate. However, that obviously that remains to be seen, and I think some people know this space far better than I do. I so again, I haven't I don't really have any specific ideas on how we might as Charis is asking, blend CERs with OBA subsidies. But what I would point out, what I can point out is that we can, depending on the particular problem in each location and the particular design solution that we put in place, we can contribute to reducing emissions through an RBF scheme as well. And the specific example I would use here would be Penang, where the RBF scheme is all about diverting the organic waste away from the landfill. And this is something which the Penang government is already wanting to do, and they're intending to fund the incentive payments themselves, not because they're going to get payments for the emissions that they're reducing from the landfill, but just because it's also going to save them money in terms of them having to of them not needing to transport as much waste to the landfill and not needing to build a new sanitary landfill because that would be expensive for them as well. So there are other motivations, and I guess this then speaks to some of the co-benefits between climate change mitigation and and achieving results in other areas as well.
Uh-huh. And I'm actually going to have one last question for the interest of time. I know we're reaching the end of this session, so I will end with one more question, Marcus, if possible. And it's from Shahina, and it's about how did we determine the cleanness index? And also there is a follow-up on that. What is the time duration for verification of indicators? And she's saying the indicators could improve and go down with time as they are mostly linked to behavioral change. I can add also, after you, Marcus, I can add something to this to the answer to this question if needed.
Okay, yeah, sure. Now on the cleanliness index and the indicators, I would actually point you to the report, because in the report we do actually describe some of this in detail, and we actually have formulae. But in essence, in summary, the cleanliness index is basically a composite. There's a formula for that, and it's basically based on visual inspection, and which, yes, I agree, is subjective. But what we did, or what we tried to do or to design in these schemes, was to basically have a kind of like a scoring chart. So where we would say, okay, a score of 100% is this, and then it's a picture of the street where it's perfectly clean, there's nothing on the street, right? And then the 90% or an 80% score is this, where maybe there are some leaves or there's a bit of paper. And then the 50% score is this. So you have a visual scoring chart. And in principle, the verification procedure would be randomly, the verification agent will go and look at this particular location or street and take a time and date stamped photo of the street at that time when the verification was done. And then you kind of say, well, based on that, any reasonable person would say, yeah, this looks like an 80% score, or whatever. Now, in terms of the time duration for verification of indicators, I think I've spoken to this, where for each indicator or part of the verification process, we do specify how frequently the verification should be done. In some cases, as I mentioned, the actual timing was sort of random, so the service providers wouldn't actually know when exactly the verification agents were coming. For example, in some cases, for certain parts of the scores. And then, yes, you're right. I mean, the indicators could go up or down, and but we usually have what we call a verification cycle. So in NINGBO, for example, it was like, okay, 6 months. And during the 6-month verification cycle, your quality scores would be randomly verified on 3 or 6 occasions, and then it would be added up, for this total score. So I hope I've answered that question. And Yara, did you want me to also speak to the other question just very quickly?
Actually, we're reaching the end. I think, for the other people, maybe we can address their questions directly, after this. We
Okay,
can
sure.
send them an email or so. I'm going to speak to this, actually. I want to say something on that. I've seen that we have lots of people today, actually, that even when I don't know the names, I thought I know most of the people interested in this area, but I will be in contact, actually, with most of the participants of today. I will be contacting you personally and to better understand your interest in the solid waste and output-based aid approach, and to explore opportunities for collaboration, and also, to learn from you, and also to address your questions that you might didn't get a chance today to raise it. So stay tuned. I will be in touch, and I hope this will be the beginning of an era of collaboration in this area. Thank you so much, Marcus. Sorry for the interest of time. I have to end this webinar. But before we leave, I want to just end up with a few information that if you are interested in listening to the recording again, or in watching our presentation or the other webinars we had before, please visit us on our webinar website at www.gpoba.org/webinars. And I would like to also let you know that we will be hosting another webinar soon, with the time to be decided, but we will keep you posted. But the webinar will be on solar irrigation in Bangladesh. And please stay tuned. More information will be available on our website very soon on that. Thank you so much for joining us, and special thanks to Marcus, who's really amazing, and who always amazes me, and always I get new information every time I hear you. And so thank you so much, Marcus, for being there, and thank you to all our attendees and participants today. And we hope to stay in touch. As I mentioned, please feel free to send me or Marcus any question that you didn't get a chance to ask. And I will be in touch anyway. I wanna just wanna end with one final thing on our feedback survey. We really appreciate if you can complete this survey before you leave, and we really hope that you get the most out of this session, and it was up to your standards, and up to your and you got the information that you really needed. Thank you so much, and I hope we stay in touch. Thank you.